The Mafia boss was straightening his cuffs in the middle of the gala when a sudden splash of wine stained his sleeve. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stared at the red liquid dripping onto his multi-million-dollar contracts. He looked up with cold, tattooed fury. A young maid stood there, trembling, clutching an empty tray. Her hair was in neat braids, her gold name tag glinting. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Park," she whispered. His men moved instantly to grab her, but Hanbin Park raised a hand, stopping them. He leaned in close, his voice a dangerous growl. "Do you have any idea what you've just ruined?" The room went silent. But the maid didn't cower. She pointed a finger right at his chest and said 3 words that stopped his heart. "I know why." Hanbin staggered back, his mouth open in shock, his hands raised defensively as if she had just pulled a weapon. "Stay with me until the end, because what Naomi Sterling said next shocked a man who thought he had buried his past forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Hanbin Park was the Dragon of Seoul. For 10 years he ran the city with an iron fist and a hidden past. He told everyone he was born into a crime dynasty, but the truth was much darker. He was an orphan who had survived the streets of Detroit before climbing his way to the top in Asia. He thought no one in this country knew his real name. He thought his tattoos hid his scars. But that Tuesday night, Naomi Sterling, a woman he treated like a nobody, reminded him exactly who he used to be. And she wasn't there for his money. She was there for justice. Hanbin Park moved through the upper echelons of Seoul like a predator through deep water. Silent, cold, and entirely lethal. To the public, he was a venture capitalist with a penchant for high-end tailoring and silent philanthropy. But within the gilded walls of the Park Syndicate, he was known as the Dragon. A man whose mercy was non-existent and whose memory was eternal. His empire was built on a singular, terrifying philosophy: perfection or elimination. The top floor of the Latte World Tower served as his throne room, a place of glass and steel that looked down upon the flickering lights of the city, as if they were nothing more than embers in a fireplace. On this evening, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the stifling weight of unspoken fear. Hanbin sat at the head of a mahogany table, his unbuttoned collar revealing the dark, intricate ink that wound around his throat like a serpent. He didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. The mere way he adjusted his cufflink caused his most seasoned lieutenants to break into a cold sweat. Earlier that morning, a high-ranking distributor had been found 3% short on a shipment of luxury electronics. In most organizations, a fine or a warning would suffice. But Hanbin didn't believe in warnings. He had stood over the man in the damp darkness of an Incheon warehouse, his shadow stretching long against the concrete. Without a word, Hanbin had used a silver letter opener to systematically destroy the man's reputation, his credit, and his future, all while maintaining a look of bored indifference. He didn't just break bones. He erased lives, ensuring that anyone who even thought of crossing him felt the chill of the grave before they ever reached it. His men, Tony and Sangwoo, stood behind him like statues, their hands hovering near their jackets. They had seen Hanbin order the dismantling of entire rival families over a single act of disrespect. To them, he wasn't just a boss. He was a force of nature. In the Park Syndicate, there were no second chances. You paid your tribute, you kept your head down, and you prayed the dragon's eyes never settled on you for too long. As the gala reached its peak, Hanbin watched the elite of Seoul mingle, knowing that every smile directed at him was fueled by terror. He thrived in this atmosphere of submission. He believed he had successfully cauterized his heart, leaving behind only the cold, hard logic of a king. He was the man who had everything, a man who had successfully buried the ghost of a starving boy under layers of silk and blood. Or so he thought, until the soft chime of a tray hitting the floor shattered the silence, and a pair of eyes from his past met his own. The crash of the silver tray echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot, slicing through the polite hum of the orchestra and the soft clinking of crystal. For a heartbeat, the entire gala held its breath. Hanbin froze, feeling the cold, wet weight of the vintage Bordeaux seeping through his white dress shirt and onto the hand-stitched silk of his suit. This wasn't just a stain. It was a violation of his carefully curated sanctuary. Slowly, he turned his head, his dark eyes narrowing into slits of pure, calculated malice. Naomi stood before him, her hands still suspended in the air where the tray had been. The gold name tag on her vest caught the light, glinting as her chest heaved with a shallow, panicked breath. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Hanbin's lieutenants moved in, their faces hardening into masks of violence, waiting for the single nod that would signal the end of this woman's life. Hanbin stood up, the wine dripping from his sleeve and splattering onto the floor like blood. "You clumsy, pathetic fool," he hissed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very glass of the skyscraper. He didn't just speak. He spat the words, his face contorting into a sneer that revealed the monster beneath the millionaire. He began to curse her in a mixture of languages, vicious, dehumanizing strings of insults that were meant to strip her of her dignity in front of the city's most powerful people. He called her a cockroach, a mistake, a waste of space that didn't deserve to breathe the same filtered air as his guests. He loomed over her, his tattooed neck tensing, his shadow engulfing her small frame as he prepared to cast her out into a night from which she would never return. He expected her to collapse. He expected her to fall to her knees and sob for a mercy he had no intention of granting. But as the final, most venomous curse left his lips, Naomi's shaking stopped. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and she did the one thing no one in Seoul dared to do. She looked the dragon directly in the eye. She didn't back away as he roared. Instead, she took a singular, defiant step forward, her finger rising to point directly at the center of his chest, stopping just inches from his heart. The movement was so authoritative, so fearless, that Hanbin's tirade died in his throat. The room gasped as the power dynamic shattered in an instant. "I know why you're so angry, Hanbin," she said, her voice cutting through his rage like a blade. It wasn't the voice of a maid. It was the voice of a witness. "I know that behind all this ink and all these threats, you're still just the boy who used to hide under my mother's porch." The blood drained from Hanbin's face. The terrifying dragon suddenly looked like he had been struck, his hands rising instinctively as if to shield himself from the truth she had just unleashed. In that moment, the most feared man in Asia wasn't a boss, he was a ghost. The heavy silence in the ballroom felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the onlookers who watched their untouchable leader crumble before a woman in a server's vest. Hanbin's breath came in ragged hitches, his defensive posture a stark betrayal of the terrifying image he had cultivated for years. With a sharp, jagged motion, he signaled for his men to stand down. His voice, once a roar, was now a hollow rasp as he commanded Naomi to follow him into the soundproof sanctuary of his private office. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the glamour of the gala vanished, replaced by the stark reality of a debt long forgotten. Hanbin collapsed into his leather chair, his hands still trembling as he stared at Naomi. She didn't wait for him to speak. She reached into her apron and pulled out a worn, faded photograph of a woman with a kind smile standing in a small, dusty kitchen in Detroit. "My mother Lou didn't give you bread and a bed so you could grow up to be the kind of man who hurts people for sport, Hanbin," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a deep, righteous disappointment. "She called you her little dragon because she thought you had a spark of light. If she could see you now, she wouldn't even recognize the boy she saved." Hanbin looked at the photo, and for a moment the tattoos on his neck felt like a noose. "Why are you here, Naomi? Why now?" "Because you've forgotten where you came from," she replied, leaning over his desk, her gold name tag catching the dim light. "Your men, the ones you claim to control, have been running a line through the neighborhood where my mother still lives. They aren't just selling drugs anymore, Hanbin. They're taking people. Young women, daughters of the community that protected you when you were nothing. They're being moved through your docks, in your containers under your name." The revelation hit Hanbin harder than any physical blow. In his drive for absolute power, he had delegated the low-level logistics to ambitious lieutenants who had secretively brokered a deal with the very predators he despised. He realized with a sickening jolt that his own organization had broken the most sacred code of his upbringing. You never prey on the family that fed you. I didn't know, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the image of the woman who had been his only sanctuary. Ignorance is a luxury you don't have, Naomi countered, her authority absolute. They're moving a shipment tonight. At the North Docks. My cousin is on that boat. You owe my mother a life, Hanbin. Tonight is the night you pay it back. Faced with the reflection of his own soul in Naomi's eyes, the dragon realized that his empire was a hollow shell if it was built on the betrayal of the woman who gave him a future. The cold, calculated logic of the syndicate was gone, replaced by a burning, ancient debt of honor. He reached for his phone, his face hardening, but this time the fury in his eyes wasn't for a spilled glass of wine. It was for the monsters he had allowed to grow in his own shadow. Hanbin stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the reflection of his tattoos shimmering against the backdrop of the Seoul skyline. The silence in the office was broken only by the heavy rhythmic thumping of his own heart. Naomi stood perfectly still, her presence a silent judgment that no amount of wealth could silence. He turned back to his desk and opened a hidden drawer, pulling out a thick stack of high-denomination bills. He pushed the money toward her, more than a maid would earn in a decade. Take this, Hanbin said, his voice regaining some of its flinty edge. Get your mother out of Detroit. Buy a house in a gated community. Get your cousin back with a ransom. I'll make the calls, I'll ensure safe passage, but don't ask me to dismantle my own infrastructure. Naomi didn't even glance at the money. Instead, she reached into the small pocket of her white apron and pulled out a single crumpled $5 bill. She smoothed it out on the mahogany desk, placing it directly on top of the stack of thousands. I don't want your charity, Hanbin. I want the man my mother believed in. $5. That's what she gave you for your first bus ticket out of the city so you could find a better life. Consider this a new contract. I am hiring you to be a protector, not a predator. The door to the office burst open and Sang-woo, his most senior enforcer, stepped in, his face flushed with agitation. Boss, we have a problem. The board is asking questions about the delay and the shipment at the North Docks. We can't stop it. The investors have already paid. If we interfere with the iron route now, it's not just a loss of profit, it's war with the Russian suppliers. It's suicide. Sang-woo glanced at Naomi with naked contempt. Get this woman out of here. She's a servant, not a consultant. Boss, listen to reason. You've spent 15 years building this. Don't throw it away for a ghost story from the Detroit slums. Hanbin looked at the $5 bill, then at Naomi's unwavering gaze. He could feel the weight of his empire on one side and the weight of his soul on the other. His lieutenants were right. The logical choice was to pay her off and let the shipment go. That was how a boss survived. But as he touched the crumpled paper Naomi had placed before him, he felt a spark of the light Mama Lu had seen in him. A spark he thought he had drowned in blood years ago. The contract is accepted, Hanbin said quietly, his voice vibrating with a new terrifying clarity. Sang-woo gasped, stepping forward. Boss, you can't be serious. Over $5? Over a maid. Hanbin stood up, and for the first time in a long time he didn't look like a man playing a part. He looked like the dragon. She isn't just a maid. She is the daughter of the woman who saved my life. And in this neighborhood we pay our debts. He swept the stack of thousands onto the floor, leaving only the $5 bill on the desk. Assemble the strike team. We aren't going to the docks to supervise. We're going there to burn it down. The transition from the opulent gala to the cold, subterranean concrete of the syndicate's basement was as swift as a blade's edge. Hanbin didn't bother changing out of his stained suit. He simply shed the jacket, rolling up his sleeves to reveal the ink that climbed his arms like rising smoke. The air in the tactical room was sharp with the smell of gun oil and ozone. This wasn't a gathering of his usual street enforcers or the loudmouthed thugs who patrolled the alleys. These were the Shadows, a small elite unit of specialists who operated in the silence between the heartbeats of the law. Target is Container Yard 4 at the North Docks, Hanbin stated, his voice devoid of its usual boardroom polish. It was now a weapon, precise and cold. He stood before a glowing digital map, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. We aren't here for a shakedown. This is a total extraction and erasure. The Iron Route ends tonight. His specialists, men who had served in special forces and lived in the dark corners of the world, exchanged silent, knowing looks. They didn't ask about the profit margins or the political fallout with the Russian suppliers. They saw the shift in their leader. The dragon was no longer playing a game of chess with the city's elite. He was preparing to breathe fire. Sang-woo stood in the corner, his jaw tight, his loyalty warring with his fear of the impending chaos. Boss, if we do this, there's no coming back. The board will see this as a betrayal of the syndicate's interests. Han-bin didn't even look at him. He was busy checking the slide on a custom .45 caliber pistol, the metallic clack-clack echoing through the room like a death knell. The syndicate's interest is whatever I say it is. And tonight, I am interested in honor. He looked over at Naomi, who stood near the heavy steel door. She looked out of place in her server's vest amidst the tactical vests and suppressed rifles, yet she was the eye of the storm, the moral compass that had recalibrated his entire world. He handed a radio to his lead specialist. Frequency Alpha. No chatter. We move in 3 teams. Team 1 on the perimeter. Team 2 on the container locks. I lead Team 3 into the office. As the men began to arm themselves, clicking magazines into place and checking thermal optics, a heavy, purposeful energy filled the room. Han-bin walked over to Naomi, his shadow looming large against the gear-laden walls. For a moment, the ruthless Mafia boss vanished, and she saw the flicker of the boy from Detroit. Stay with Sang-woo, he commanded, his voice softening just a fraction. He will keep you safe. By dawn, your cousin will be free, and the debt will be settled. Naomi nodded, her hand momentarily brushing the gold name tag on her chest. Don't just settle the debt, Han-bin. Be the man she knew you were. He didn't respond with words. He simply turned, his face hardening into a mask of stone, and let his shadows out into the night. The dragon was awake and he was hunting. The North Docks were a graveyard of rusted iron and salt-crusted concrete, shrouded in a fog so thick it swallowed the moonlight. Han-bin moved through the labyrinth of towering shipping containers with the predatory grace of a ghost. He no longer felt the chill of the midnight air or the dampness of his wine-stained shirt. All he felt was the heavy weight of the .45 in his hand, and the crushing responsibility of the $5 contract tucked against his heart. Behind him, the shadows were mere flickers in the periphery, moving in perfect synchronization with his lead. The warehouse district was supposed to be a dead zone at this hour. Yet the hum of a portable generator betrayed the life inside Container Yard 4. Han-bin signaled with a closed fist. The team vanished into the shadows of a stack of weathered blue crates, as a guard emerged from a nearby corrugated shack. The man was a mercenary, his neck thick and his eyes bored, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He never saw the flash of silver. One of Han-bin's specialists slipped from the darkness, catching the guard before he could even gasp, lowering his body to the pavement in a silent, macabre dance. They advanced deeper into the heart of the Iron Route. This was the dark underbelly of Han-bin's own machine, a place where his name was used to authorize atrocities he had spent years pretending didn't exist. He watched through thermal goggles as 2 more guards patrolled the perimeter of a massive, unmarked white container. They were laughing, oblivious to the fact that the dragon they served had arrived to execute them. Han-bin didn't delegate this time. He moved forward, merging with the darkness until he was standing directly behind the tallest guard. With a precision born of survival and refined by violence, he neutralized the man with a clinical strike to the throat, catching the heavy rifle before it could clatter against the ground. Simultaneously, a suppressed shot from his lead specialist took down the second guard. The only sound was the distant lap of the sea against the pier and the faint, rhythmic thumping of the generator. The perimeter was clear, but the air felt charged with a different kind of tension. Han-bin stood before the heavy steel doors of the central container, his hand resting on the cold metal. He could hear muffled sounds from within, the soft, rhythmic sobbing of women who had lost all hope. His jaw tightened until it ached. For years, he had told himself that his business was clean, that he only dealt in high-end contracts and political influence. But standing here in the cold filth of the docks, he realized he had been the architect of a nightmare. He looked back at his men, their night vision goggles glowing like the eyes of demons in the mist, and gave the final signal. They weren't just opening a container, they were opening a door to his past, and there was no turning back. The steel doors groaned as Hanbin threw them open, the sound echoing like a scream across the desolate pier. He expected to find a cargo of contraband, but the reality that met his eyes was a physical blow to his chest. The interior of the container was a cramped, suffocating cage, lit by the flickering orange glow of a single hanging bulb. Inside, nearly a dozen women were huddled together on thin mats, their faces pale with terror and exhaustion. Among them, sitting in the far corner with a defiant spark still burning in her eyes despite her bruised temple, was a woman who shared Naomi's gaze. This was the cousin she had spoken of, the one whose life was currently being weighed against the syndicate's profit margins. But as Hanbin stepped into the light, he realized the horror went far deeper than a single family. Stacked against the walls were crates labeled with his own corporate logo, containing not just electronics, but falsified passports and travel documents. His men, hardened by years of underworld warfare, stood frozen at the entrance. They had seen blood and betrayal, but the sight of these women, some no older than teenagers, shook the foundations of their loyalty. This wasn't the iron route of a sophisticated narcotics trade. It was a human auction house operating in Hanbin's shadow. He saw the ledger lying on a small folding table near the exit. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning names, dates, and prices. The scale was staggering. It wasn't just this container. There were records of shipments stretching back months, coordinated by his own lieutenants and the rival brothers he had once considered necessary business partners. "Get them out," Hanbin commanded, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "Now." He walked over to Naomi's cousin, kneeling in the filth of the container floor. He didn't look like a billionaire or a king. He looked like a man seeking penance. He reached out a hand, but she recoiled, her eyes darting to the tattoos on his neck, the brand of the monster who owned the docks. "I'm a friend of Naomi's," he said softly, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "She sent me. You're going home." The woman's breath hitched and slowly she reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched his sleeve. The weight of his failure pressed down on him with a crushing force. He had built a throne on a mountain of secrets, but he had been blind to the fact that the mountain was made of lives. As his specialists began to guide the women out into the cool night air, Hanbin stood up, his gaze fixing on the warehouse office at the end of the pier. The men who had done this, the ones who had used his name to mask this evil, were still inside. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He only felt the singular, burning need to erase the stain he had allowed to spread. He looked at the $5 bill tucked into his glove, a reminder of the boy who had once been saved by a woman's kindness. Tonight, the dragon wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting to prove that the boy wasn't entirely dead. The fog clung to the ground like a burial shroud as Hanbin led his team into the heart of the district. The silence here was unnatural, a heavy, artificial quiet maintained by the threat of violence. Every step Hanbin took felt like a descent into his own past. The damp, industrial smell of the docks mirroring the alleyways of Detroit where he had once scavenged for scraps. But now he wasn't the prey. He was the shadow moving within the shadows, his movements dictated by a lethal practiced grace. His elite unit moved in a tactical V formation, ghosts in charcoal gray gear that vanished against the rusted walls of the warehouses. Hanbin signaled with a subtle tilt of his head toward the first sentry post. A guard stood under a flickering amber light, leaning against a stack of tires, a heavy submachine gun slung carelessly over his shoulder. He was one of Hanbin's own auxiliary soldiers, men paid to look the other way. Hanbin didn't wait for his specialists. He blurred forward, his polished shoes silent on the oily asphalt. Before the guard could even register the movement, Hanbin's hand was over his mouth, and a precise surgical strike to the base of the skull sent the man into a dark, permanent sleep. There was no anger in the act, only a cold mechanical necessity. Hanbin lowered the body into the shadows, his eyes already scanning the horizon for the next target. They reached the perimeter of the main yard, where the white shipping containers sat like teeth in a giant's mouth. 3 guards stood near a burning barrel, their laughter echoing hollowly against the metal. They were discussing the bonus they expected from the night's shipment, their voices thick with greed. Hanbin felt a surge of visceral disgust. These men wore his colors, but they had traded his code for the filth of the iron route. He raised 2 fingers and then pointed. In a synchronized flash of suppressed muzzles, the air hissed 3 times. The guards collapsed simultaneously, their bodies hitting the ground with soft thuds that were swallowed by the hum of a nearby crane. Not a single alarm was raised. The shadows fanned out, securing the perimeter with the efficiency of a scythe through wheat. Hanbin stood at the edge of the kill zone, the ink on his neck feeling hot against his skin. He looked down at his hands that had signed the checks that paid these men, hands that had built this machine. He realized that by seeking to be untouchable, he had become the ghost in his own house, unaware of the rot eating the foundation. He gripped his weapon tighter, the $5 contract in his pocket, a heavy reminder of his true mission. He wasn't just here to eliminate guards. He was here to dismantle the version of himself that had allowed this to happen. The containers were ahead, and the air was thick with the scent of salt, iron, and a debt that was finally coming due. The heavy, armored SUV pulled into the flickering neon shadow of the neighborhood grocery store, its engine a low rhythmic growl in the quiet of the pre-dawn hours. Hanbin sat in the back, the cabin smelling of smoke and salt, his hands finally beginning to steady. Beside him, Naomi's cousin sat wrapped in his own silk suit jacket, her eyes wide and fixed on the storefront where a single warm light spilled onto the pavement. Inside the store, the hum of the old fluorescent tubes was the only sound in the stillness. Naomi stood by the counter, her server's vest wrinkled and her gold name tag askew. But her gaze never left the door. Mrs. Chun sat quietly on a stool behind the register, clutching a cup of tea, her presence a silent testament to the community that had refused to break. When the bell above the door chimed, the sound was sharper than any gunshot Hanbin had heard that night. Naomi didn't run, she lunged. As her cousin stepped through the door, the 2 women collided in the center of the narrow aisle, surrounded by stacks of canned goods and bags of rice. The sob that broke from Naomi's throat was a raw, primal sound of relief that seemed to shake the very shelves. They held each other with a desperate strength, a tangle of tears and whispered prayers that filled the small shop with a warmth no heater could replicate. Hanbin remained by the door, a dark silhouette against the streetlights. He looked out of place in this world of simple needs and honest labor, his tattooed neck a stark reminder of the violence he had just left behind. He watched Naomi press her forehead against her cousin's, their shared grief finally turning into a fragile, miraculous peace. For the first time in 15 years, Hanbin didn't feel like the dragon or a king. He felt like a guest in a house he had almost helped burn down. Naomi looked up, her eyes meeting his over her cousin's shoulder. There was no more accusation in her gaze, only a profound, weary acknowledgement. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill he had left on the desk. She walked toward him, the fluorescent light glinting off the tears still wet on her cheeks, and pressed the bill back into his hand. "You kept your word, Hanbin," she said softly. "The debt is paid." Hanbin looked down at the paper in his palm, the price of his soul. He realized then that he couldn't go back to the man he was before the wine spilled. The pure pedigree he had fought so hard to protect was gone, replaced by something much older and far more valuable. He didn't say a word as he turned to leave, but as he stepped out into the cool morning air, he tucked the $5 into his breast pocket, right over his heart. The dragon was still a boss, but for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was protecting. 6 months after the fire at the North Docks, the penthouse office of the Latte World Tower looked the same, but the atmosphere within it had shifted from a vacuum of fear to a place of quiet, focused purpose. Hanbin Park stood by the window, but he was no longer looking down at the city as a kingdom to be harvested. Instead, His eyes were fixed on a small, hand-drawn picture framed in simple wood on his desk, sitting where the syndicate's ledger used to reside. It was a drawing Naomi had sent him. A crude but vibrant sketch of a Detroit porch, a dragon curled protectively around a small house. Beneath it, in elegant script, were the words, "For the boy who remembered." The park syndicate still existed, but its iron route had been cauterized and replaced. The dark capital that once fueled human trafficking was now diverted into the Sterling Foundation, a sprawling network of community centers and safe houses spanning from the backstreets of Seoul to the neighborhoods of Detroit. Han Bin had discovered that true power didn't come from being untouchable. It came from being the one person who could be touched by the right hand. His board of directors had tried to rebel, but the dragon had silenced them not with violence, but with the terrifying efficiency of a man who no longer had a past to hide. He had stepped into the light, tattoos and all, and found that his truth was his greatest weapon. As the years bled into a decade, a strange tradition took root at the Latte World Tower. Every year, on the anniversary of the night the wine spilled, a small, unmarked envelope would arrive at the front desk. Inside was always the same thing: a crisp $5 bill and a short note that read, "For the next soul who needs a way out." Naomi had moved on to lead the foundation, but she never let him forget the value of that first contract. Han Bin sat at his desk, now an older man with silver threading through his hair, his neck tattoos a map of a life reclaimed. He picked up the latest $5 bill, feeling the weight of it. He thought about the night he had been the good guy, the night a maid in a server's vest had looked through his armor and called him by his name. He realized then that his legacy wouldn't be the skyscrapers he built or the rivals he broke. It would be the quiet, steady rhythm of lives being rebuilt with his silent help. He tucked the money into a dedicated drawer, ready for the next time the world felt too big and too cruel for someone small to navigate. The dragon was still a guardian, but his fire was no longer for destruction. It was a beacon for those who thought they were lost in the dark.